Hi, all. Welcome. Thank you for joining. I'm Greg Fischer. I'm a partner in the London office of BCG, working on social impact and sustainable finance. I'll also say that in my spare time, I'm still a professor at the London School of Economics, actually teaching courses on data science and impact investing. And I'm just super grateful for the opportunity to moderate this panel about how data can help build a more equitable world. And really, with no further ado, I'd like to turn the spotlight on our three panelists to let them introduce themselves. And I'll say, in addition to the typical introduction, I'd really love for you each to share why you're really passionate about what you do, because I think that it's easy to think of data as a bit dry. And I think conveying everybody's passion is just a great way to start off this session. With that, I'd like to start with Rachael Weiss Riley, who's the director of the data clinic at 2 Sigma, and kind of helped bring this panel, or was responsible for bringing this panel together. Rachael?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks to all of you for attending. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize Aaron Stein, head of operations at Data Clinic, who really was instrumental in putting this all together. So thank you, Aaron. As Greg mentioned, I'm director of Data Clinic, which is the pro bono data science and tech for good arm of 2 Sigma, a financial sciences company that's headquartered in New York City with offices in other locations. So Data Clinic, just to provide a little bit of background, was founded about 7 years ago by a group of employees who really wanted to give back using 2 Sigma's core skill sets. So we partner with mission-driven organizations, and we provide data science and engineering support on a project basis. And one such collaboration I'd really like to highlight is our partnership with Robin Hood's Learning and Tech Fund. And you'll be hearing from Steve shortly, who is really instrumental to this project. But this work was really the impetus behind the subject of this panel, and a really great example, I think, of how we can move this work forward together. So I guess to address the second question, so my background, I'm trained as a public health epidemiologist, and I think that my interest in really supporting organizations in their use of data stems from this background. So something that has stuck with me for decades, back in Epi 101, I learned that epidemiology comes from a couple different Greek words. One is epi, which means on or upon. Demos, and I think I'm getting this right, is about people, and logos means this study of. So if you kind of smush those things together and take them together, epidemiology is really about the study of what happens or befalls a population. And as I mentioned before, this stuck with me because I think that what makes me so passionate about this work is the people that are behind, or in front of, or on top of, or next to the numbers. It's really about combining the sort of the history and the context with the data to empower communities and be able to let them tell their story.
That's great. Thanks, Rachael. And I also had to learn a little Greek along the way, which we're doubling up on the knowledge transfer here. So next, I'd like to introduce Michelle Shevin, who's the senior program manager for the technology and society team at the Ford Foundation. Michelle.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Shevin. My pronouns are she, her. And yes, I work as the senior program manager of the Public Interest Technology Catalyst Fund on the technology and society team at the Ford Foundation. And I'll be talking more about what that sort of jargon salad means in a moment. Like Greg, I also have a spare time job, to the extent that any of us have spare time these days, as an adjunct professor of futures thinking methodologies at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program. And I'm passionate about enabling sort of collective rethinking, collective reimagining of what we mean by things like innovation and progress and change in this really critical moment for our species. So I'm excited to be here today and talk about how data sort of threads through that mission and through Ford's work in the public interest technology space.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And finally, to Steve Azeka, a program officer at Robin Hood's Learning and Technology Fund. Steve?
Thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Azeka, and as mentioned, I'm a program officer at Robin Hood Learning and Tech Fund, and really Robin Hood's the foundation, not to be confused with the financial app, is really trying to lift New York City families measurably and sustainably out of poverty. And we're a data-driven organization. And the part that I'm responsible for is on the education side, and even more specific, is around computational thinking at the elementary level. So how can we really get students early on to start thinking about data and to be thinking critically about it, not just to become data scientists and not just to become computer scientists, but to really see this in all different domains. And this is one of the things I've been passionate about is, for me, being a teacher, it's great being able to see the things, all this sort of phenomena that happen out in the world firsthand. But, going back to the topic of equity, thinking about, what are the larger trends? What can we actually see? And data helps us with that understanding. So excited for the panel. I'll kick it back to you, Greg.
Great, thanks, Steve. Let's see, that's great. I think it's kind of sets the stage of the different perspectives that we're going to have on data and equity from the practitioner side, from the NGO and from the folks who are doing the data enabling to make this all possible. And we'll try and reflect those views along the way there. But because we are all data driven types, I'd like to start with a quick poll to get a sense of how the participants that we have here actually would define their organization when it comes to data. Would you think of yourself as data driven, data curious, or more in the data terrified camp? Take a moment to pop that in if everybody can see the poll up on their Zoom screen. What I'll do actually is I'll kind of just can you guys see the results here? I guess we are a well-selected group, a very small number of people in the data terrified group, and a lot of data driven folks. It's helpful. We will use that kind of data driven aspect to structure our answers for, I think, some of the questions along the way there. And so when we'll come back to some of the thoughts that will come out of the poll and this distribution as we get to the Q&A portion of our panel. But with that, I'd actually like to jump in, Rachel, by asking you a question where I think that a lot of us have seen the news talking about algorithmic bias in the use of data, and there's lots of great and really important work that's being done to understand bias and think about how to create more ethical algorithms. And there's a lot of techie stuff around that. Is that what you see as the key activity and what we're talking about here today?
Yeah, this is a key point, Greg. Glad you brought that up. So yeah, I mean, as we all know, we're sort of bombarded by a lot of discussion around bias and AI and ML and deep learning and algorithms and all that good stuff. But I think it becomes really easy because of that to think of equity and data as only relevant to big data. And many of the conversations around data equity, new word maybe, I don't know. But many of these conversations often start out at this like pop data science level. And I think that the purpose of this panel is really to ground this conversation and to make it applicable to everyone. So, particularly at Data Clinic, we really believe that anyone can start thinking about how they might apply data to drive equity in their work. And we apply this in all of our partnerships, really trying to shift this approach away from one of equality, which is really about treating everyone the same, kind of regardless of need, to one of equity, which is providing what is needed to succeed. So with data, we often see this one size fits all approach, but this just really isn't the case in a lot of our work. So for example, when we think about data and applying equity, we've created a simple framework that starts with the data and starts asking questions. So who is represented, who isn't represented? Then it moves on to the approach. What are you trying to optimize for? What are you trying to do? And then it kind of ends with the application. So who are you, reaching and how? And I think that, these are only just a few examples of some questions, but they really get folks started thinking about, what are the challenges that you or your organization are facing? What do you want to accomplish or to understand? And then to, best approach it, kind of embedding equity along the way.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. Michelle, I'd like to turn it to you for your perspective on this. Both on really the role that you see data playing in being able to to push forward equity the equity agenda, and also, how your perspective might differ coming from the perspective of a funder, relative to, and seeing it across a landscape of a number of different organizations that that you're providing resources to.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So yes, funders sort of sit at this 50,000-foot view, which happens to be a place I'm quite comfortable. My background's actually in anthropology, and so I love sort of, looking at the, the many different ways in which data can be applied in both big and small ways. I think we're all using data in at least small ways every day. And for funders, data shows up in the way we hold ourselves accountable to the theory of change that we have, and the sort of change we want to see in the world. It shows up in the way many funders sort of measure progress against, their own sort of goals and outcomes that they've set. It comes in, and especially, equity data. I think Ford Foundation has a little bit more of a qualitative approach to measurement and evaluation, but we do specifically ask all of our grantees, to speak to diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in terms of sort of the makeup of their own staff, and in terms of how they approach their work in the world. And of course, like, I think a thing to say here is that data is a measurement of something at some time, right? It's a snapshot. It's actually meaningless without context. And when you get a bunch of it together, it can tell a story. But what we don't want to do is think of data as being representative of some sort of objective truth. Rather, it's like an important tool to help us sort of align across our many subjectivities, right? So for most inquiries, like, we don't need to choose between qualitative or quantitative analysis. It's both and. It's about expanding on our organizational sense-making capabilities, right? So at Ford, I work on a strategy that we call public interest technology, which intentionally borrows from public interest law. And more than 50 years after the civil rights movement, it can be hard to imagine that there was a time before we had legal defense funds and legal aid and institutions like the NAACP and pro bono norms at law firms, and really a whole field dedicated to using law to advance justice and equity, right? We can almost take it for granted, but those were explicit investments that were made to build the field of public interest law. So when we talk about public interest tech, we're talking about technologists and tools and infrastructure that really help us prioritize values like equity, and how technology, and especially data-driven tools, are designed and deployed and maintained. And that's not lip service, right? Like, we can talk about equity, but there's real trade-offs. If you're optimizing for efficiency in a system that's producing inequality, you've just sped up inequality, right? And that is not, Ford's whole mission is to reduce and prevent inequality. So that's really important to us. When I think about equity and data, I think about how data records a history of structural inequality. And so it can be a really important flashlight that we can shine on inequity. But if we're not careful, if we don't approach data through that equity lens, it can become an amplifier of inequality. But it's also, as I said, it's a flashlight. It's a flashlight in this sort of darkness of information overload, information disorder. So being more intentional about using data in service of equity is a really powerful tool. And the good news is that there are organizations like Data Clinic that are sort of purpose-built to help you do that. So from a funder perspective, it's really exciting to see a massive amount of just upswell in terms of the tools that are being developed, the structures and supports that are being developed to help organizations really of all kinds start to use data more effectively and particularly more equitably in service of their work.
Well, that's great. So actually, I like that image of kind of shining a flashlight, right? Of trying to make some sense of that. And with that kind of spirit, I'd like to just quickly kind of shine a flashlight on ourselves and just get your take on this, because I think that this idea that in the conversations we had leading up to this, where it's not necessarily fancy algorithms that lead the way. It's oftentimes just using simple data to start conversations and encourage action, or at least an action bias towards conversations. I want to just share a little bit of data quickly about our panel and get your reaction to it. So can everybody see my screen now? Right. So the screen I'm sharing is just some very simple data about the composition of our panel. And I'd love actually, maybe starting with with you, Steve, just to get your reactions to to this simple data, and in a sense, kind of what it is. And I promise I know that you were forewarned that you'd be put on the spot for this. I want to come back to Robinhood, but I do really want to start thinking about where simplistic, making ideas concrete, where really simple data clearly described can actually start encouraging more effective conversations here.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and I appreciate this slide. And I like the idea of the sort of spotlight, right? This being one example of that. And I think it goes to sort of the larger context, right? That this is just a small sample, but could potentially speak about larger, talking about philanthropy as a whole, right? What is the representativeness of this, of within data science, that now we can start asking these questions. And in hopefully 20, 30 years from now, that I would not be the only person of color on this panel, right? Not for a lack of effort on anyone's part, but I think it goes to show some of the larger challenges. And with this type of data and similar types of data, ones that we work with at 2 Sigma Data Clinic around, we've been able to really think about strategies for our own work. For example, this is why we're investing in computational thinking at elementary levels. We really need to start thinking critically about who is in the positions that we're currently in today, as far as our current panel and the composition of that, and really starting to ask questions on what does the pathway look like for that, and what's the current situation that we're currently in right now, as far as who represents both, not just on race, but on gender representation on many of these other aspects. So I think it's helpful seeing this, and definitely it's a good question starter, I think, for us.
Rach, I want to give you a chance to speak to this as well, because I know this is an area where you spent a lot of time thinking about this as you were putting this whole panel together. I would love to get your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I think this is really something to be open and honest about, and to start having these tough conversations, to recognize a lack of diversity and work towards building diverse teams. But I also think this is where we need to talk a little bit about the importance of allyship, right? And that kind of all of us need to step up and do this work. And we can't necessarily expect that the hard conversations and the hard work is going to be done solely by, underrepresented individuals. And so I think that I sure hope that this isn't a future panel down the line, but at the same time, I think that component of allyship is one that we need to address, and have kind of everyone take an active role in looking towards more diversity, inclusion, equity in all of our work.
Thanks. And I also, Michelle, I want to kind of get your thoughts, because you framed this in all of our conversations, being really careful about talking about data as showing us some information, if we're lucky, perhaps the truth, but only as a snapshot in time. I would love to just get kind of your take on this, kind of both as it relates to this very small sample size of data, but also more broadly, just to drill in a bit on that kind of snapshot in time concept.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the slide title sort of says it all. Simple data starts conversations, right? It helps you ask questions. It helps you frame questions. It's not the beginning, middle, and end of the story. It's an input, right? It's an input alongside, qualitative sense-making processes, alongside engaging the people who are impacted in that data, right? That's really, really critical. It's easy to forget that that the data isn't the whole story about somebody. It's just, in some cases, an arbitrary measurement about somebody at some point and some time, right? So, the important thing to sort of remember is that data is a tool in a toolkit, right? That data has to be contextualized within the contemporary moment that we're analyzing it during, but also, and with respect to the fact that it is it's also representative of a particular history, and that in many cases we do not want to repeat or emulate or reify the patterns that are represented in that history. So taking the sort of equity approach to data is so critical, because it reminds us to engage the people who are represented in that data, because it helps us remember that there are historical dynamics that will be reflected in that data almost inevitably that we would not want to replicate. It helps us to kind of bring that quantitative lens on what we all know to be true, which is that we live in a complex, ever-changing reality, and that data, again, is a snapshot that helps us sort of refine our perspective on where we want to go in the future. And so taking that sort of past, present, and future approach through the lens of something like data, which tends to be static and a snapshot of a moment in history, I think is just a really interesting, an interesting sort of approach to take. And everybody's on a learning journey here, right? Nobody's sort of cracked this nut. We're all just, we're all figuring this out together. And to the extent that we can be much more equitable and inclusive about that process of figuring things out, the better, right? The more that data can feed back into the creation of feedback loops, right? We're always looking for what are the leverage points to kind of get to the change that we want to see. Data is an important ingredient there, but it's not going to be the whole story and it's not going to be the whole answer. So just being, just taking the care and respect to understand like what data is, but also what it isn't. And just constantly iterating and refining our approach to actually framing a problem, and framing our problems and our questions that we take, that we take a data-driven approach to in conjunction or in collaboration with the communities who are represented in that data and who will be most impacted by any use of that data becomes really, really critical.
Oh. So I'm thinking about that. I mean, in terms of the way people engage with data, I think it's a real challenge to make these conversations concrete, right? It's easy for things to get very abstract and a bit airy. And a question I love to ask is sort of, can you give a concrete example of where data has really kind of changed your thinking? And not, oh, I realized data was important, but really like had a practical, concrete impact on the way you were operating as an organization. And I'd love, Steve, given your engagement and also the work you did with Data Clinic, love to start with you, but I really want to give everybody a chance to talk about this, because I think that kind of making it personal and real it demystifies a lot of even for data-driven people, how you actually put this into practice.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah. So just to give a little bit of context of, I mentioned that a lot of our work is around education, specifically around New York City. So one of the challenges that we're faced with is, we have lots of different partners doing different things, and it's how do we recruit schools? So we initially came to the Data Clinic really asking, how can we forecast the schools that may be doing well, that we can maybe sort of select those particular schools, and thinking about, academic performance. So we had these different types of questions that we weren't entirely sure what we could do. This was sort of, in the abstract, a shooting in the dark in many cases. A lot of the colleagues I had, they're not necessarily, I would say, the most data competent, but are data curious people. And, I think what's really helpful was, as we worked with the Data Clinic, we really were able to pinpoint what is it that we really care about? What is it that we really can't answer with data in a very valid way? I think going back to Michelle's point, right? You can do lots of things with data. You can get good data, you can get bad data, you can do good things and bad things with it, right? And, I think working and teaming with people who know how to do this sort of process and figure out the questions that we really wanted to answer in the end really landed us in a better space. So in the end, we were able to find out what is it really that that we don't want to just look at academic performance. That's one component, but there's many different areas that we should also consider as far as when we want to think about performance in a school. And they were generous enough to lend their time and be able to create these amazing models that were able to really challenge us to think, okay, now here are a different approach to now recruiting with schools that go just beyond looking at academic performance and just looking at particular demographic thresholds. So really challenging us to open up our minds as far as how we can approach recruitment of schools, that being a sort of tangible example. And it's really pivoted our way that we now recruit schools and who we look at and who we consider for our different initiatives.
Greg, I'd love to follow up on that, because so one thing that Steve has not made clear was the incredible role that, the folks who are doing this hard work, the, content area experts are, how important their involvement is in all of this. So, we come in and we are fairly sector agnostic. We'll kind of work across different types of projects, domains, et cetera, but that's only because we're relying on the folks like Steve who are doing this hard work and know the data and know the context and the history, like Michelle was saying. And it's really the combination of, folks on the technical side of things, maybe coming to the problem with a different perspective, right? With fresh eyes in connection with those who really understand the data, the problem, the issues. And it's together that kind of relationship and that collaboration that is ultimately impactful. So it definitely takes two to tango for sure. And I would just want to add too that, I think with the Learning and Tech Fund project, equity is not a binary thing here. It's not equitable or not equitable. I think what, this panel, we hope to get across is that you can apply equity or think about equity in multiple different facets of a project, right? So that's in thinking about your data, right? Who is represented, who isn't represented? Was the data meant to do what you are hoping it does? Are there biases inherent in the data, et cetera? And so I think a lot of the sort of lessons learned and the value add that came out of that project is an understanding of what can and can't be done with that data, and then how to approach the problem or tackle the hypothesis of, can we find schools and kind of expand the pool of potential school partners in a way that is more equitable. And for us, that meant actually trying to do comparisons within schools that have similar characteristics and identifying schools that were maybe overperforming relative to schools that were comparable in some way, shape, or form. And so it sort of put that flashlight that Michelle talks about, right? Like a lens on these schools that might be overlooked if you were to apply a absolute threshold for, say, performance. If you're saying, if you have this performance and you're over it, you're out. If you're under it, you're out. Instead of doing that, it's a much more relative approach where you're taking into account the context, the history, the nuance, right, of the data that goes into these models to make or to create an approach that's more equitable. And so I think I don't want folks to come away with this thinking, is this equitable, is this not? It's more about answering or asking questions and being inquisitive in your process from the hypothesis, laying out hypotheses, right? And getting the right folks at the table, thinking through the data, the approach, and then the application of it. What are you going to do with it? And so you can kind of embed that in there in every step along the way, as best you can, or at least be intentional about asking those questions.
And I'll just jump in there, because I think it's a great segue. I love this idea of getting past the binary, equitable or not equitable. Public interest technology is an approach to technology, not a type of technology, right? So people will say tech or data for good. Public interest tech asks good for who? So that power analysis is key, and it has to come in at every step of the process. So it's really about centering a set of public interest values and prioritizing them, again, where there's trade-offs. I'm in this funder collaborative, which is when program officers from different foundations kind of get together and say, maybe we have some shared strategies or shared approaches or shared goals, and kind of what could we learn or do together better than apart. I'm in a data funders collaborative, and it's this community of sort of data curious and data enthusiastic funders. And we started getting together over 3 years ago, and we sort of looked at our grant making, we looked at our strategies, we did sort of landscape analysis of what guidance was out there for funders and for groups that would be our grantees. And we started honing in on a couple of big gaps in the landscape of how funders were approaching data. And so one of these was actually impacted community engagement, right? There was not enough investment in how do we really let people represented in data and most impacted by data-driven technology lead how that data gets used. And the other gap, which is relevant to the community engagement gap, was really about equity. So equity is relevant, of course, not only in the questions you're asking data about your problem space, but also in how you frame the problem, who's included in your problem framing again. So thinking through how you scope your inquiry in a way that's driven by equity is really important anywhere that we have data available or that we're looking for data, right? So data, so we kind of have this, we've committed internally to a set of sort of equity principles as funders together, and data becomes a tool not just to improve decision making sort of writ large or in general, but really to help us gut check our own assumptions, to help us make our assumptions explicit, to help us make our values and goals explicit, right? So data becomes a part of this process, again, where you're iterating on your problem frame, thinking about those feedback loops, looking for those leverage points. So data is just really critical. It's funny, as a group of funders that are excited about data, we sort of use data to revise our perspective on data, and have really honed in on equity and community engagement as the places to collaborate and to work together.
So I want to follow up on that actually, and starting with Rachel of thinking about that interface, right, of how you bring equity into the conversation and framing it as being able to to ask the right questions that can really have this action bias within organizations, but one that has some sense of, I think there's already a question in the chat of really what does kind of the equitable use of data mean. And so I'd love to get a sense, Rachel, starting with you, of how you manage that interface with organizations that, look, in most cases have day jobs, right? Like data exists as from an instrumental perspective to help answer fundamental questions, maybe about how they can do what they do better. At the same time, kind of guiding them to bring in that kind of that thinking about equity into that process, and how does that work for you guys who in many ways are kind of shepherding through people through what is sometimes a very dark and confusing valley of turning kind of confusing data into actual knowledge?
Yeah, well, I can tell you what it isn't. It definitely isn't taking a whole bunch of data and throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks. That's definitely not our approach. So, I mean, I think I've said this before, and I'll say it again and continue saying it. It really begins with questions for us. And I think that the beauty of starting with the questions is that this process can be applied to lots of different types of organizations. So it can be those that are just starting out, learning about data, thinking about data, how to become data driven, whatever that means to them. And then those that might have a huge team of engineers and data scientists. So I think that it's important to recognize that often the question that you think you want to answer is different if you really do dig into the why. So why specifically are you interested in this? What would it help you do? What do you plan to do with this information? And for each of these key questions, you can keep going. But if you focus on kind of equity a little bit, by focusing on the people who are impacted, affected, have a seat at the table and a voice at the table, and those who don't in each of these questions, you can start to dig a little bit deeper and hopefully come up with something that is going to be impactful in your work. So, just off the top of my head, a couple questions are, are you including all the stakeholders? Is everyone represented at the table? Is the approach like the Learning and Tech Fund's approach, is it suitable for everyone, right? Are you missing out on folks? Is it biased in some way? And then more importantly, even, who is defining success? What does success mean to different stakeholders? And how are you communicating to those and with those who are involved in the process? So I think that a lot of organizations come to us, and a lot of us just as humans, right? We have a lot of hypotheses and a lot of assumptions that we feel are right. And maybe they're right, but I think those really need to be gut checked. And I think that this is usually a perfect starting place when thinking about using data to be more equitable. It's just a way to kind of think through, gut check some of your assumptions, and build a foundation to then kind of add on additional hypotheses, research questions, analyses, et cetera. And then I think I wanted to highlight one other thing, which Michelle already brought up, but it's worth saying again and again and again, which is that there is such an importance in complementing all data insights with the context, the history, the nuance, right? The intuition of the communities who are impacted, which is another reason why I say always start with those questions.
Can I ask you a question? And this one's, I think it might be a bit challenging, and it's also a bit of a jump ball for anybody who wants to answer it, which is, Rachel, you described something which I think is really fundamental, this notion of asking questions about kind of, are we leaving out any of the stakeholders? But my experience, and I think that this kind of resonates with some of the questions that have also popped up in the Q&A, is that it's often challenging that our definition of stakeholders is often kind of the product of this residual snapshot that was asked from data that was in the past. So take the gender representation on the panel, right? If we would have put that slide up 10 years ago, it would have had male or female, right? And we've evolved to a point where we now think of it in a much more kind of spectrum and self-defined way, which is huge progress, but it's really easy to define our stakeholders based on the data snapshot that was determined by the people who had power, oftentimes people who look a lot like me, and we missed out on key bits of the community. So how do you, what can we do to really bring those questions of equity to the forefront so that we're not kind of answering yesterday's question, but kind of driving towards tomorrow's kind of hopefully better reality.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So there's huge innovation in the way that questions can be asked and in the way we think about what evidence and data actually mean, right? So we actually need to complicate the sort of historical legacy of like what data actually means, right? We think of data as like numbers on a spreadsheet. Really, data is like any useful information about anything. And again, it's a snapshot of a moment in time, right? A measurement. And so we can get really creative actually about how we're collecting data. Doing it in partnership with the people that are represented in that data is key. And it sounds really expensive and complicated, but actually like will contribute to making the work stronger and the eventual problem solving, like you've got kind of built-in buy-in. I'll share a couple of resources in the chat that I think are relevant to actually a bunch of this question and a bunch of the questions that have come in. As I said, we're all on a journey here, and there are some really, really helpful resources that have come out just in even the last 2 or 3 years that I think are fantastic and potentially useful for lots of different stakeholders and sectors and groups. So share in the Q&A. I have an option to do panelists and attendees. So why don't I see if I can and broadcast it out in the chat. But the first one is from Chicago Beyond, and it's a report called Why Am I Always Being Researched? And it's from the perspective of, impacted community members who are, asking the question, why am I always being researched? And it gives tools for how you can do more inclusive and equitable kind of data collection and data use processes. Similarly, there's a collection of resources from the Our Data Bodies project, which is out of the Allied Media Projects. And it is relevant to issues of data sovereignty. It's relevant to issues of impacted communities. And really it's sort of participatory action research project in and of itself to help understand the ways in which, data is being collected and used today, which of course is changing all the time and has changed rapidly in the last 10 years or so, how that's really impacting communities on the ground. And whether we're even, as a sector, as a philanthropic sector, as a social change sector, whether we've been using, asking the right questions of data, whether we've been using data in ways that will, actually drive toward equity. So I'll share that link as well. There's a feminist data manifesto that came out last year, which is a little bit more relevant to the kind of big data scene, but really, I think, powerful and gives a perspective on how we can really upend some of the kind of inherent white supremacy and colonialism that is embedded in the way that we tend to think about data by default. And then finally, I'll just share a resource that I'm very proud to have helped contribute to, which is from the UPenn's AISP Institute. That's the Actionable Insight for Social Policy, if I'm getting the acronym right. And they came out with a toolkit about racial equity in data sharing. So anytime you've got a data set and you're trying to kind of combine that data with other data to answer questions, it's a huge moment that you need to center equity. And so the AISP has actually come out with something called the Racial Equity Toolkit. And it's really, really useful in, it includes, actual approaches from practitioners who are doing data differently and doing data in a much more equitable and inclusive way. So I would recommend all of those resources. And of course, there's many, many more that we could share, but just really quickly, I don't think we'll have time in this panel to kind of unpack all of the richness there, but it's a massive, massive space of innovation, just as exciting about, or maybe even more so than the sort of big data and tools that are being developed for sort of advanced analytical purposes. This kind of innovation on the ground in terms of how we ask questions, who's included in the problem framing and the question asking, and then of course how we approach people to, rather than extract data, to really use data in service of being in closer collaboration with the communities that we want to impact.
I want to just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Actually, maybe we're going to say the same thing, but what I'd love to do is we've been talking about lots of really big ideas again, and I want to bring this back to the practical, because I think the distribution between and I think there are a lot of like very important topics we could talk on for a while, but I'd like to get into the if you were talking to somebody, and we see that of the folks on this call, the spectrum is really largely between people who are data driven or data curious, and my apologies to the 3 data terrified folks. We hope we didn't scare you further away. But I'd love to ask kind of Rachel, starting with with you, kind of practically, if someone said, look, I am data driven, I want to bring an equity lens into what I'm doing, what do I do tomorrow? Like starting off the day tomorrow, like what should I do? And after this, I want to jump into the Q&A and give everybody a chance to talk more about that. But I'd love to kind of leave off the official panel with something really concrete.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Greg. So I just wanted to quickly address another kind of component of what Michelle was talking about, listing out some incredible resources, which is there's also a total dearth of data on a lot of things. And a lot of the data that we do have, it was derived for a different purpose. And I think we need to be really intentional about what it can and when it cannot measure. And again, the historical context around that data for sure. So I think like for those kind of starting off and really wanting to move this forward, it again starts with questions. Sorry, I sound like a broken record, but I mean, I really think that you need to get everyone at the table and you need to start brainstorming a wish list of like hypotheses you want to test, assumptions you want to gut check, things that you want to understand about maybe your community, about your reach, about your impact, and then start small. A lot of this can seem kind of overwhelming, like where do you even go? But you can start small. Often, we found that a proof of concept that doesn't actually, you don't really need to leverage a lot of resources there, is often all you need to build this foundation to gain buy-in from other folks in your organization and maybe even external funders, and then really be able to build upon that kind of base work over time. And then just to address the question, there might not be data to answer your questions. That's the reality of, I would say, 80% of the questions we come across with our partners. But there's no time like the present to start collecting, but you're not going to know what to collect and even how to even answer those questions if you haven't thought through, what am I trying to do with this? Is it okay to be collecting these things? Am I allowed to, et cetera? And so I think that, starting off with these baby steps, and then also if you don't have the data necessarily, there are a lot of publicly available open data resources out there. So, check out your local open data portal, and perhaps there might be enough data there or something, right, to shine a light on your questions and to get you thinking about what would be needed to move and iterate onto the next step. So my overall kind of take home is, get the folks together at the table, as many as you can, be as inclusive as possible, start asking questions, and then start small and build upon that.
That's great. I'm going to come back to that at the very end, but now I want to encourage everyone to, the Q&A has been open. We've got some great, and I will say very deep questions that themselves could have been the grist for an entire hour-long conversation. And I apologize that I don't think we'll do them justice in the next 8 minutes. But we'd love to kind of encourage folks to add more to the Q&A, and we'll try and curate these out to folks along the way there. As we look towards that, there's a question that I'd like to ask of all of you, and I'd like to angle for really short answers, right? For a reason that I hope will be obvious for all the folks out here, which is that I think everybody, and we've had conversations, as I suspect everybody knows, kind of offline, kind of talking about people's views here, and I think everyone fundamentally believes that the effective use of data starts with a good question. And I find that oftentimes that when you get organizations to show up and actually start thinking about, well, what questions do we want to ask? That often can be a daunting activity in and of itself. So if you were to start tomorrow and say, look, what one question should you start with asking, right? Just one kind of, interrogative statement. What would that one question be that would start the conversation that kind of brought, data and equity into the playing field for how you'd be more effective as an organization? And anybody can start with that one.
I'll jump in because I have a fairly canned answer to this that I use again and again in my work, and this has been true in any job that I've ever had. The first question I always ask is, what is at stake? And even asking and answering that question requires having an inclusive conversation, right? So it immediately calls you to reconsider who you think of as your stakeholders, to reconsider what you're hoping to change in the future, to reconsider the historical context of the work that you're doing, and it comes from my training as an anthropologist, but just asking, what is at stake? What is at stake in a turn towards data? What is at stake in this, change that I'm trying to see at the world? It's a simple question, but it can really open up the space to reimagine, a lot of the received wisdom and a lot of the sort of knee-jerk assumptions we might make about problems and things that we hope to see change in the world.
I like that one. Steve or Rachel, what do you guys think?
I'll build off on that one. In conjunction with that one, I'll add, I think really who are our key stakeholders? Really not just going at the numbers, right? But really diving into more rich data around them as individuals. Because in the end, for our foundation and for all the work that we do, we're in service of them, not the other way around. They're not just a data point, right? They're individuals. There's a certain level of humanity, and we want to be able to understand that before we even start the journey, or else it may lead us astray. So that's my short answer.
I like both of those answers better than mine, and I'm annoyed that I can only ask one. But I would probably say, what's your key blocker? And I think from there you can kind of jump off onto a bunch of different tangents, and I'll sort of leave it at that.
I'm gonna steal every one of those actually when I get to ask more than one question. So I think that there've been a number of really good questions in the in the chat. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I want to actually get kind of responses from folks who in how to address the question of how we think about data sovereignty, right? And it was one of the first questions that showed up in the chat, but various versions of this kind of it's a thread that runs through a number of the questions, and also a number of conversations that we have, which is that there is that sense oftentimes that that our stakeholders are in many ways kind of contributing their data, and you can be seen as kind of taking data from vulnerable populations. And Steve, kind of starting with you, how do you think about what is equity, not just in how you ask the questions about the data, but how you're using the data and what that means for your stakeholders?
Yeah, maybe I'll reference back to Michelle's one of her earlier links, but the sort of participatory research component of it, that there's a certain level, and maybe this answers an earlier question of transparency and action, that when we as a fund and when we work with teachers, when we work with students, that they're not just being things done to them, right? That when we have these discussions about data, that they're in the room. That it's not just the partners that are there, that we're seeking feedback. Let's collectively, now that everyone's in the room and that we have some of the findings, preliminary findings from it, let's actually talk through it. Let's actually give feedback around it and have agency. And then when thinking about the solutions, that next phase of that, or what we're going to do in response to this data, once again, we think about communities. We think about collectively trying to come up with this together. So we're not automatically privileging my ideas, my individual idea of what I think should happen, versus the students and the teachers in this example of what they're doing, right? That these don't necessarily need to be these silos that we artificially create.
I'll jump in and a group that I am a huge fan of that I think is innovating a lot in this space is the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance out of the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and they had an amazing experience over the past 4 or 5 years where they were very involved with the local community on the issue of the school to prison pipeline, on racial disparity in school discipline. And Minnesota is one of the worst states in the country in terms of racial disparity in school discipline. And a progressive district attorney and the county sort of said, we're going to integrate a bunch of data that we have about students and families, and we're going to create a predictive model of which kids might eventually end up in contact with law enforcement. And the community said, we don't want that. That is going to, that's racist. That's racist data. We know that data reflects a racist history, and it will feed into the development of a racist prediction model, and it will end up labeling our Black and brown kids as future criminals. And they sort of saw that coming, and they organized and they stopped it. And there's sort of this real resist and refuse moment that we're in now, where we're having to push back against the sort of the sales and marketing language about what especially big data can do in communities. And we have to stand up and say, we cannot predict people's life outcomes. That's mathematically, not true, that we can predict these important things about people's lives. And it would be wrong to try to do that. So they have a no data about us without us fellowship. They're creating community impact assessments, community benefits agreements around uses of data. And they're really fighting what Ruha Benjamin calls the datafication of injustice, right? When the hunt for more and more data is a barrier to acting on what we already know. So they're saying we as a community know what we want to solve these problems. We want more counselors in schools. We want smaller class sizes, the same old thing, right? But we're in a moment where power really needs to hear what communities are actually asking for. And it's often not more data collection. It's give us what we've been asking for a long time. So we're in this interesting moment where we do need more data-driven approaches, more equity-driven data approaches. And sometimes that means backing away from data as an approach that we're using to solve a problem.
So Michelle, I apologize for cutting you short on that because it's a great answer, but I think that's a perfect way to wrap up, which is that this is the start of the conversation, and it's a conversation that was started by data, but really has to apply to facts on the ground and how things actually work. And so this is not self-compartmentalized. We are all as you can tell, passionate about this. And I would say that for those of you who want to take next steps, one of those is to do internally, but the other one is to reach out to any of us to further your data conversations and thinking about this. I know that everyone would love to continue those conversations. I know we didn't get to a lot of the Q&A, but I hope this was really an engaging panel. I know I really enjoyed it, and just want to thank everybody for participating and all of our three panelists for what was a super exciting conversation, and I hope helps us all take the next step on this. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot. This was great.